Good day to all of you. I am AC and I welcome you to this fourth lecture of the video series where we are discussing the topic of rhetoric, specifically the different figures of speech that you have in your syllabus. In the last lecture, we were discussing the figure of speech of simile and we learned how to define simile with the help of a few different examples. We have learned that when trying to define simile, we need to remember a couple of points. Firstly, the things that will be compared in a simile, the different entities or elements or subjects, whatever we want to call them, those two things, they must be different in kind. They must be different from each other. The second thing is that though these two elements would be different, there should be some certain kind of underlying similarity between them, and this existence of similarity should provide us with a point for the comparison that drives the figure of simile. Thirdly, the expression of this similarity, this underlying similarity between the two different things, must be presented very explicitly, presented very clearly. And we can discern whether this comparison, this presentation of similarity is explicit enough or clear enough by noticing use of certain words such as like, as, to name a few. Then when we are trying to observe a proper use of this figure of speech, we should keep in mind that a proper use of simile should draw on a comparison or expression of similarity which is not very obvious or commonplace. And this balance should be observed in the opposite extreme end also, as the point of similarity should not be too much obscure or unintelligible. So I hope it has been clear to you by now that in case of simile, we observe a very clear and explicit expression of points of similarity between two different entities which are very different in nature. So now if we think about the purpose of using a simile, there can be a couple of different purposes for using a simile. First, a simile can be used to explain something, to make something easier to understand. And this is mainly used when we are using simile to instruct someone. So in case of didactic literature or instructional speeches, this figure of speech, simile, can be used to make sure that the audience or the readers achieve a proper understanding or a clearer understanding of the topic. However, simile, this figure of speech can also be used to appeal to the human heart. Simile can be used to address our emotional needs. So in such a case, simile is used with the purpose of pleasing one's aesthetic sense. Again, when we look at different examples of simile, we might notice that as we have two different entities, two different elements, which are somewhat different in nature, yet they contain some point of similarity between them. So when we compare them, we can notice that sometimes one of them would be more well known than the others. One of them might be a bit more commonplace, a bit more familiar than the other. So in such an instance, we will find that the expression of a similarity might have progressed from two different directions. One possibility is that the author might have tried to elucidate the lesser known or a little bit obscure entity by comparing it with a better known or more familiar entity. So in this case, the simile might be called an explanatory one. as it tries to explain a lesser known entity by comparing it with a better known entity. The other way to execute a simile is more inclined towards achieving a poetic or aesthetic effect than trying to provide an explanation. So, in such an instance, the author would be trying to describe a relatively familiar or well-known idea or entity, and then trying to illustrate a similarity between that idea or entity and another one, which would be a little bit more abstract or lesser known. So this kind of simile does not provide any explanation or does not make things easier to understand, but they serve the purpose of decoration or beautification, a decorative simile, you can say. However, similes can be executed in a number of ways. When trying to describe an abstract concept, the author can draw on a concrete object and try to show the similarity between them. Or the author can try to do the opposite. When describing a concrete entity, the author can draw on the similitude between that entity and an abstract concept. Again, in many cases, the two different entities that constitute a simile can both be very familiar to the reader or the audience. And another thing to keep in mind is that when we are saying all these things, familiarity, unfamiliarity, something being very commonplace or something being a bit obscure, all of this is very subjective because whether something is familiar to you or unfamiliar to you depends on a lot of things, a lot of different variables, we can say, like time and space and your social condition. So difference in cultural coordinates can really affect a reader's understanding of language and as an extension of that their understanding of figures of speech. Simile, for example. Okay, now let us take a look at a few different poems where simile has been used. These lines are from Henry Louis Vivian de Rosier's poem titled The Orphan Girl. And these are the first few lines. They read, her hair was black as a raven's wing, her cheek the tulip's hue did wear, her voice was soft as when night winds sing, her brow was as a moonbeam fair. So you can notice that Derosio has used multiple instances of simile in these few lines, trying to describe the orphan girl. Her hair has been compared to a raven's wing, the similarity being that both of them are intensely black. Then the softness of her voice is found to be similar to the softness of the gentle breeze flowing through the night. And the poet also finds her brows to be similar to a fair moonbeam. Notice how that in all of these instances of simile, the author has used the word as. So this use of the word as points to the fact that the comparison made here, the expression of similarity here is very explicit, very clear, and this is clearly an instance of simile. Let us take a look at another piece of poetry, this time from a poem by Nissim Ezekiel, who was one of the towering figures of 20th century Indian poetry. This poem is titled Night of the Scorpion, and the poem deals with a scenario where the narrator's mother was stung by a scorpion. So one of the sections describing the aftermath of the mother getting stung by a scorpion describes the situation thus. The peasants came like swarms of flies and buzzed the name of God 100 times to paralyze the evil one. So I believe you have noticed by now that the first line of this section contains an example of simile, where the peasants who have come to visit the poisoned mother, they are compared to a swarm of flies. The use of the word like and the clear reference to the swarm of flies, it marks the use as one of simile. Sometimes the figure of speech of simile can provide a base, a framework for an entire poem. I believe that Langston Hughes' poem Harlem is an instance of such an usage. The poem is named after Harlem, a black neighborhood in the city of New York, a neighborhood where mostly African American people lived. In this poem, published in 1950s, Hughes is writing about the dreams of African American people. The poet writes, "What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode?" So here Hughes is writing about the dreams of millions of African American people, the dream of living a life of basic human dignity, which the blacks, the African Americans, were denied for centuries, and even now the things are only marginally better. So Hughes is asking what happens to a dream that has been deferred, that has not been achieved by the people who dreamt that dream. So here Hughes is describing that deferred dream by comparing it with exposing the similarities of that dream with a lot of different things. He compares it to a raisin in the sun which has dried up, or he compares it to a sore, a wound that has festered. He compares it to the stink of rotten meat. So almost the entirety of the poem is based on different similes, where the deferred dream is compared to a lot of different things. And notice how this dream, dreamt by a race of people, this dream, which is an abstract idea, is compared to a lot of concrete elements, a lot of concrete entities, in order to explain it more clearly. So next time when you read a poem, try to notice whether that poem also includes instances of simile or instances of other figures of speech that you have in your syllabus. So this is where we will end today's lecture, and in our next lecture we will continue discussing the rest of the figures of speech that we have in our syllabus.